insects are the majority of species on the planet, and some people have described them as being kind of like the oil that lubricates the whole system, that it would grind to a halt without them.
When you hear the words climate crisis, you probably think of rather large animals, endangered species like elephants, rhinos. You might think of extreme weather events like hurricanes, volcanoes, earthquakes, all rather large in scale. But in fact, one of the major protagonists in this broader story of climate systems breakdown is rather small. I'm talking about insects, arthropods, the kinds of things actually you can find in the cracks in your back garden. And yes, this is bigger than just bees potentially dying out and pollination. It turns out that arthropods and insects are the backbone, the very oil which permits the machine of our planet to keep ticking over. It's also important to talk about them because, actually, it's somewhere we can make a difference. Like I say, these critters are in your back garden and your local park. But perhaps, the argument would go, you can make a change there rather than waiting for government to do its bit. All in all, insects and their role in the climate crisis is under discussed. We barely talk about it enough. And I'm not just talking about bees and pollinators. There's far more besides. So I'm very lucky today to be joined by Dave Goulson. He is a biologist, a conservationist. He's also a writer and one of the leading experts in the English-speaking world on insects and their role in the climate crisis. Dave Goulson, welcome to Downstream.
Pleasure. Nice to be here.
Well, I'm very happy you're here. I have to say, I became acquainted with your works properly only over the last few months. I've seen you here and there. Then there was a great write-up in the Financial Times about what's basically going on with insects, which we're going to talk about today. That's the content of today's interview. And then I looked at your your YouTube channel rather. These charming videos you make about cider.
Charming is a polite way.
And bees.
Yeah. Gardening, the environment, food, it all kind of fits together. At least it does in my garden. And so I try and encourage people to garden in a kind of wildlife-friendly way and enjoy homegrown produce and all that kind of stuff, which is fun. They're pretty amateur hour. My editing skills are minimal, but these are some of them at least seem to be quite popular.
Yeah, the cider one, I really recommend it. But besides the homesteading, you're actually also a very eminent biologist, an entomologist.
Yeah,
Insects. I have to say, the several books of yours that I've read over the last several months have catalysed within me a fascination with insects, a reverence and an awe for insects, which has surprised me.
Job done.
Done.
That is basically the idea, because most people don't like insects. Most adults anyway. They pay them no attention. They know nothing about them. They think they're a bit disgusting. They call them bugs, creepy crawlers. They're likely to squash them more than anything else. And I think that's really sad. I know I'm a bit weird, and I've been into insects since I was a little kid and never kind of grew out of that. But not only are insects really important, but they're actually just kind of really fascinating and cool if you spend the time to look. But I find it so frustrating that most people never do. You can find them in your back garden, city parks, pretty much anywhere, but most people go their whole lives without really once looking at them.
What's the most beautiful insect in the world, according to Dave Goulson?
Oh, God.
What's the goat?
There are loads you could choose from. The Spanish moon moth, I'll pick a random one today. If you ask me tomorrow, you get a completely different answer. But they're beautiful, big silk moths found in the Pyrenees. Amazing kind of emerald green, intricate patterns on their wings and long tails. Gorgeous, gorgeous creatures. Butterflies and moths were actually my sort of first love before I became hooked on bees later on.
And throughout your book, Silent Earth, there are these periodic portraits of different insects or arthropods. Is that the broader word?
Arthropods are things with an exoskeleton, so that includes spiders as well as insects, and crustaceans like crabs and lobsters and shrimps and everything. So arthropods is a much bigger group. Insects are a kind of subset of the arthropods.
And you're talking about that there is this idea of parasitic wasps that go onto a caterpillar. This is one that really sticks in my mind, that go onto a caterpillar, and then there's a parasitic wasp on the parasitic wasp.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an extraordinary, you say in the book actually in Silent Earth that you're not religious, but there's an extraordinary beauty in it, and it's very easy to understand why somebody would believe that the world had been intentionally designed by a superior intelligence. The way that you talk about this stuff is just mind-blowing.
Yeah, they are astonishing. I mean, I don't put it down to God, but there is a lovely quote from a biologist, JBS Haldane, who's long dead now, but he was asked in an interview like this one, what his studies of evolution had taught him about the nature of God, and his response was he must have an inordinate fondness for beetles, which was tongue-in-cheek because he was an atheist, but however they came about, there are something in the region of 250,000 different types of beetle alone. Just this incredible diversity. And we've only scratched the surface. We discover new species all the time. And so far we've named, I think it's 1.1-ish million species of insect. But it's estimated that there could easily be another 5 million. Wow. So we haven't yet discovered most of life on our own little planet. Isn't that extraordinary? So yeah, they're incredibly diverse. They've been around. Insects were pretty much the first animals to crawl out of the sea about 480 million years ago, which is just an unimaginable length of time. They've been around twice as long as the oldest dinosaurs, which has given them time to evolve into this extraordinary variety of shapes and sizes and colours. And the weirdest life histories, like the parasitic wasp that parasitizes the parasitic wasps that parasitize the caterpillars and so on. Some of them are really minute. The smallest parasitic wasp, actually, the smallest insect is just under 0.2 millimeters long. So you barely suspect to the naked eye. And then the biggest ones are moths with wingspan of about a foot. So there's quite a range.
That's really extraordinary. You are, as I've said, an academic biologist, entomologist. How would you classify yourself? An entomologist?
An entomologist, an ecologist, a conservationist. I guess I combine them all to some extent.
And you said your first love was butterflies and moths, then you went into bees. We're going to talk about bees a lot because, of course, they're not just a quote-unquote charismatic insect. They're really important for life on Earth, including us. But you were an academic biologist, conservationist, but you've increasingly been drawn to writing popular science books. If you don't mind me saying, in middle age, it's not something you were doing in your 20s, I presume.
No, the first one, Sting in the Tail, was published 2013, and written, I guess, 2 or 3 years before that. It took me a while to persuade anyone to publish it. I guess, to start with, I studied insects because I just thought they were interesting, and my research wasn't particularly applied. I wasn't all about conservation. It was more about insect behavior, trying to understand what they do and why they do it out of fascination rather than any practical benefit. But then over time, I became more and more aware that they were disappearing, and that not only is sad for people who like insects, but actually is worrying for all of us because they do really vital stuff. So my research became more applied. I started to focus on, trying to understand why they were declining and what we could do to turn it around. For example, how we might change farming or how we might change the way people garden to make the world a more insect-friendly place. And we published lots of sort of academic studies on those things. But eventually I got quite frustrated because it didn't seem like anyone was listening. Politicians, gardeners, farmers don't read academic papers. They're often behind a paywall. They're written in a kind of a fairly unhelpful sort of scientific language, which isn't particularly easy for lay people to follow anyway. They're not intended for a wide audience. They're intended for other scientists, but other scientists aren't going to do anything very useful with that knowledge. So I started a charity. The Bumblebee Conservation Trust was the first sort of thing I did to try and actually change, have some real impact. And that kept me busy for a few years and has been a success, and I'm really pleased with that. But it's still, on its own, isn't going to save the planet. It's grown and it does good things. It's creating habitat for bees. It's raising awareness about bumblebees and so on. But I still thought there was still an awful lot of people out there that aren't engaged with this agenda at all. They don't care about insects. So how do I get to all those people, the probably 95% of the population that don't really think about environmental issues much at all, certainly not about insects. So I thought, well, I'll write a book, a popular book, and try and get people that way. And I figured there were lots of, having spent at that point, I guess, about 25 years studying bumblebees, I had lots of kind of interesting stories about travel in search of interesting bees and studies we'd tried to do, which don't always go quite to plan. And so I wrote this book, A Sting in the Tail, hoping that someone would like to read it. Took a while to persuade a publisher to take it. Well, first of all, you have to find an agent. The whole process of publishing, once you leave academia, is quite different. I'd been used to scientific journals and their way of doing things, and there you just send them a manuscript direct to the journal. But I quickly discovered with sort of more mainstream publishing that you can't contact a publishing house direct as an author. They don't talk. They literally, you look at their website and it says, "Do not send us unsolicited manuscripts. We won't reply." So you sort of hit this brick wall. So you need an agent, and I had no idea what an agent was. I thought that's what film stars had or whatever. Anyway, so you go online and you dig around, and I contacted dozens of agents, and most of them weren't interested in this obscure book about bumblebees. But eventually, after lots of false starts, I got an agent that was genuinely enthusiastic, and it didn't actually take him long at all to persuade Jonathan Cape, it was, to publish it. And then thankfully it's done really well. It was helped by Radio 4, BBC Radio 4 had it as their book of the week, which got some sort of a good attention for it, and it was shortlisted for what was called the Samuel Johnson Prize at the time, which also helped on the publicity front. And it's still, still most people out there haven't read any of my books and are still not interested in insects, but I've sucked in a few people. I've had some lovely emails from people who say, I picked up your book. I wasn't really interested in bees, but, someone recommended it or had nothing else to read or whatever. And actually, and now I filled my garden with wildflowers, bee-friendly flowers to help save the bees. And, and that's great. It makes it sort of feel like you've done something useful with your life, which...
So something useful like that's really interesting, because you're saying that you were publishing academic papers for 25 years and then the shift kind of happens around 2010. What specifically catalyzed it? Was there a story? Was there a moment of political failure?
It is a combination of things, I think. I mean, one is the biodiversity and climate crises have become more acute. Noticeably, the information we have as to how rapidly they're progressing and how big the impacts of them are already being, has increased really rapidly in recent years. And it reached a point where it was just something that, I couldn't ignore. And I mean, it's hard, it's all quite depressing actually, because we really are making a mess of the planet. But it was also happened to be around 2010 that I got involved in research on pesticides and bees, which was something I hadn't been involved in before. But at the time I was running the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and some of the members picked up on this, there was a bit of a sort of controversy emerging about a class of insecticides called neonicotinoids, which beekeepers were convinced were killing honeybees. It started out, the chemicals were introduced in the mid-90s, so they'd been around a while at that point. But the scientists had started to, initially French beekeepers flagged up that if their beehives were near sunflower fields treated with these new insecticides, their hives were dying, and they connected the two reasonably enough. And scientists started to do some research on honeybees and these chemicals and seemed to confirm that actually, yes, these chemicals were causing honeybee hives to die out. And so the members of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust were saying, well, if these things affect honeybees, don't they affect bumblebees? Is this why bumblebees are declining? And so I started doing work on that. And actually, so we did some experiments, fairly simple stuff, but we basically kind of mimicked having bumblebee nests exposed to a field of treated oilseed rape, which is a crop that bumblebees like to visit, and which at the time was treated with these chemicals. And we knew the chemicals, when a crop is treated, there'll be traces of chemical in the pollen and the nectar that the bees are eating. So we kind of replicated dosing bee nests with the same kind of concentration they'd get if they fed on an oilseed rape field. And basically the nests did really badly compared to control nests. Doesn't sound wildly exciting, but anyway, we got this. It was published in Science, which is alongside Nature, is one of the top 2 science journals in the world. And it was published next to another paper on the impact of these chemicals on honeybees. And Science decided that this was quite a big story by this stage. So we had a big press release in Paris. They flew us out to some fancy old building and had all the French press and some international press there. For the launch of these 2 papers, and it got a lot of attention, but there was this immediate backlash, which I guess I was naive, but I'd never encountered the kind of power of industry lobbies. And so my team and the French team that had published this other study on honeybees came under attack from the agrochemical industry, trying to criticize what we'd done, criticize us personally.
How personally?
Claiming that we'd made up the data, which is a pretty, that's a strong thing to say to a scientist, because the whole of science is based on trust, really. Anyone could make up data, but you trust that they wouldn't be so stupid as to do that, because it's pointless. What are you trying to achieve? It's not science. And so those kind of accusations are, they're certainly upsetting and have to be taken seriously. Anyway, so I got embroiled in this kind of fight, really. And it was a bit of an eye-opener. I mean, the tactics that were used were the same as the tobacco industry have used for decades to try and discredit scientists that come up with evidence that shows there's a link between, in that instance, tobacco and ill health. Trying to produce counter evidence. They employ their own scientists who always find these things are harmless. Trying to lobby politicians and create enough doubt that the politicians can avoid doing anything, because they can say, well, there's no clear scientific consensus here, we don't need to act. And it was exactly the same. You see it with climate science as well at the moment. Anyway, it was a bit of a shock to the system. I'd just been quietly studying butterflies and bees all my life, never done anything controversial or been involved in anything like that. Most of my studies said we need more flowers in the countryside. Well, nobody gets upset if you say there should be more flowers. But if you say product X seems to be killing bees, then you're threatening, sales worth, in some cases, billions of dollars a year. And suddenly, that's a whole different world. Anyway, it was interesting. And history suggests we were on the right side of the argument, because the European Food Standards Agency banned those chemicals in Europe in 2018. So it took a few years. and it took a lot more research by both us and lots of other research groups. But it did seem that it's quite a nice example of where scientific research did actually lead politicians to do the right thing in the end. At least in Europe, the rest of the world is still spraying these chemicals all over the place. And there's still a few niche uses in Europe that are still allowed. But, it feels like it was a bit of a victory. We won that battle anyway. And that, has made the world a slightly better place for bees. They still have a bunch of other problems, but at least one of them has been more or less solved.
So correct me if I'm wrong, the way that neonicotinoids harm bees is that they undermine their ability to navigate. They're effectively drunk or drowsy. They get up late. It turns them into kind of schlubs, right?
Well, so it does lots of things. I mean, they're neurotoxins. They're the equivalent of Novichok for insects. So they kill them outright at really quite small doses. It takes, for a honeybee, then it takes 4 billionths of a gram, which is, an unimaginably tiny amount, to deliver a lethal dose to a bee, which, to put that in context, means a teaspoon, which is 5 grams of one of these chemicals, is enough to give a lethal dose to 1.25 billion honeybees, just 1 teaspoon. And we're applying hundreds of tons of these things to the landscape. So they kill them. But at even lower doses, that's when it makes them sort of drunk. Impairs their brain. And these are neurotoxins, so they become uncoordinated. They become slower at flight. They become disorientated, so they can't find their way back to the hive, which is catastrophic if you're a bee, because if you lose your hive, you're as good as dead. They also do other things like reduce the fertility of male bees and impair the immune system of bees, so they're then more prone to outbreaks of disease in the hive and so on. So there's a whole raft of lethal and sublethal impacts of these chemicals. And it's not just on bees, they're just as poisonous to butterflies or beetles or anything else. So the bulk of life on Earth, which are insects, are threatened by these chemicals. I should say before, it's really easy to get tunnel vision and focus on one particular problem. And you see, scientists do it. I guess it's human nature. You get stuck into something and you dig really deep. But actually, this is just one group of chemicals. In Europe, farmers use about 500 different pesticides, which are all different types of poison to either kill insects or plants or fungi or whatever. And banning one particular group probably isn't really the answer, because they're just replaced with something else, and there are new pesticides invented all the time. So although we won a bit of a battle, unfortunately, the way we farm and the way farming is done globally now, this sort of very intensive approach to agriculture with loads of chemical inputs, that is the problem fundamentally, unfortunately. And it seems to me that this is all very serious, but the biggest challenge, this sounds a bit daft right now, given all the terrible stuff happening in Ukraine and the Middle East, but amongst the biggest challenges facing mankind in coming years is working out basically how do we feed, it's going to be 10 billion of us quite soon, how do we feed 10 billion people without destroying the planet? Because what we're doing at the moment is destroying soil, wiping out biodiversity. It's a big contributor to climate change. We can't carry on doing what we're doing at present, I would argue. We need to find a better, more sustainable way to grow food. But that's not easy to do, particularly with a big, powerful lobby that quite likes the current system and profits very handsomely from it.
You talk in the book about, and we'll talk about glyphosate and we'll talk about various other pesticides. You talk in the book about insect populations over the last 100 years falling by between 1% to 2% a year. Now, I presume that's talking about the UK.
No, that's the best global estimate that we have, but the confidence limits are pretty wide. You know, that the data we have for regions outside of Europe and North America are pretty poor. But that is the best published estimate of insect declines at a global scale.
So we're not talking about biomass of insects, because of course you can get one or two insects proliferating somewhere. We're talking about a 1 to 2% decline in the kinds of insects, the insect diversity, over 100 years.
That is in abundance of insects, numbers of individuals, as best one can estimate it, which, as I say, is not easy to do. But essentially, it's there are so many insects, and most of them live in the tropics, where there are a few scientists. The data we have are really patchy, but all the bits of data we do have show decline, more or less. So most of those studies are from Europe and North America. But overwhelmingly, they show that insects, their ranges are contracting, and they're becoming less common in the places where they still occur. With some exceptions, there are some insects, with there's so many insects, there's always going to be a few that are doing okay. But the clear pattern is one of decline at a rate which is hard to discern exactly, and is bound to vary from place to place, depending on what's happening locally. And if that continues, then the consequences are pretty scary, because people may not like them, but these insects are doing all sorts of ecological jobs that something has to do with them. There's no real replacement for insects, and the best known of which is pollination, of course. Bees and lots of other insects pollinate our crops, and without that, we definitely couldn't feed the current population, let alone what we're going to have in a few years' time. But they do loads and loads of other things as well, which are less well recognised.
So is it 2/3 of crops require pollination?
It's 3/4.
3/4. Wow, even worse.
Yeah. That said, that makes it sound perhaps worse than it is, because the quarter of our crops, that's in terms of numbers of sort of crop species.
Yeah.
The quarter of our crops that don't require pollination happen to include some of the biggest crops in terms of volume. So the grasses, things like wheat, barley, rice, oats, and corn, don't need insects. They're pollinated by the wind. And obviously that comprises a lot of what we eat in terms of bulk. But the healthy stuff, the stuff that gives us all the polyphenols that are all the rage these days, the vitamins, the minerals, the fiber, that nearly all of that comes from fruits and vegetables, which we all know are really good for us. But nearly all of those are pollinated by insects. And without the insects, the yield would, in some cases, be zero, and in other cases, be reduced. But it would make it incredibly difficult to feed a healthy diet to the human population if we were to lose a big chunk of our fruit and vegetable production, which is what we're looking at if we lose insects.
And chocolate and coffee.
Yeah, which, is a pretty awful prospect, isn't it? So yeah, it's, people should take this really seriously, because it directly affects all of us. This isn't just something that a few, crazy tree huggers like me should be worrying about. Everyone should be worrying about it.
So besides pollination, because I think that is the one that most people are like, okay, well, I like bees. People like bees generally, or maybe less so wasps, but generally speaking, they like pollinators. What else? Not that this is why we should preserve biodiversity, but what other practical uses and functions from the perspective of human beings, our rational self-interest, do insects perform?
Yeah, so there are several. They're important biocontrol agents, so they're predators of pests of our crops. Admittedly, the pests are also often insects, but everyday examples people are familiar with would be things like ladybirds and lacewings, which eat aphids, which otherwise would reduce the yield of our crops. And there's a strong argument to be made that the future of sustainable farming would involve doing much more to encourage natural enemies of pests rather than trying to kill them with pesticides. Anyway, so there's natural enemies. Then probably the biggest area, and a really unglamorous one, is recycling of stuff, of organic matter, particularly dead material, so dead bodies, and animal dung, things like cowpats. Insects play a really vital role in breaking up the cowpats, in burying little packets of dung that they lay their eggs on. Dung beetles, dung flies, and so on. And it doesn't sound particularly important, but without that, the nutrients in the cowpat wouldn't be recycled and available for plants to grow, which is then the cows eat and continues the cycle. And there's a really neat example of how important that kind of everyday process is from Australia, where when we took cattle to Australia, it turns out there aren't any native Australian dung beetles that are able to deal with cow poo. It's too liquid. Marsupial poo is quite dry. And so the Australian dung beetles literally drowned if they tried to feed on cow shit. So what a way to go. And so we'd introduce cows, large herds of cattle, and the pats were just drying and solidifying and covering the ground in a solid layer of cow poo, which was stopping the grass from growing, locking up all the nutrients. I can't off the top of my head remember the figure, but there were thousands of square kilometers of grazing land that became useless because of this accumulation of dung. And so they set about finding some dung beetles from elsewhere in the world that they could import to Australia to do the job. And to cut a long story short, they eventually introduced them from South Africa, which has a roughly similar climate, but that could cope with cow dung. And then within just a few years, the beetles proliferated and all the dung was swept away and the grass started to grow again and the farmers were happy. But it just illustrates, that these little dung beetles are doing something really vital that we can't do without. So broadly, there's this really vital role they play in recycling in nutrient cycles. So I mentioned dead bodies and cowpats, but also things like leaves, tree trunks. When a tree dies, it takes a while, but it's slowly decomposed by an army of little burrowing beetles and wasps and so on that chew their way through it. And again, that's a really vital job. And they do other things too, insects. They help to keep the soil healthy by tunneling in it and aerating it, and they distribute seeds and so on and so on. But all in all, insects are the majority of species on the planet, and some people have described them as being kind of like the oil that lubricates the whole system, that it would grind to a halt without them.
You make a compelling case for it. I mean, even with flies, obviously people just view them as completely unnecessary, sort of divine mistake. But that's not the case at all, is it?
You say fly, but of course that term encompasses about 150,000 known species for all sorts of...
The common housefly.
Common housefly, yeah. So their larvae feed mainly on dung and other organic rotting material and help to clear it away. They might be quite annoying, but they also contribute to pollination. They visit flowers to some extent. And of course, their food, things like swallows and swifts and house martins, their favorite food are small flying insects like houseflies. And one of the other sad consequences of declining insect numbers is we've seen big declines in the numbers of things that people often care much more about than insects, like swallows and swifts and so on. Their food supply is disappearing as insects decline. And when you stop to think about it, actually, there's a huge proportion of life on Earth that depends on insects for food, not just birds, but bats are almost all insectivores. Lots of freshwater fish, trout, salmon eat insects, reptiles, amphibians, they're all eating insects. So if the insects go, then so do they.
Yeah, the birds one is interesting. I've been to NEP actually several times over the last couple of years. Isabella Tree is somebody we really want to interview, but she's very hard to get hold of. And you talk about NEP in the book, which of course is, for those who aren't aware, it's a pretty large rewilded farm over the last 20 years in Sussex. And I remember going there in midsummer, and you walk, there's various trails you can go on. And I remember just putting my foot down in some long grass, and this effusion of insects just jump out, and it makes you realize, wow, this was probably quite ordinary 50, 60 years ago, if that, in much of the country. And now it's kind of disappeared. I mean, it was like something from a dream, it was unthinkable in terms of the biodiversity we see around us today.
Yeah, I funnily enough, I interviewed Izzy Tree last week on stage at the University, Sussex.
I wish we'd got you before.
We had a screening of their new film Wilding, which is same title as the book, which is really cool. I have to say, I'd highly recommend it. But I love NEP because it shows that nature can recover. You just it's 3,500 acres. It's a big estate, but it's just been for 23 years now. It's been essentially left for more or less unmanaged for nature to do its thing, and what nature has done is proliferated. There are huge. You notice it not so much. I mean, it is fantastic to see grasshoppers in abundance and all these other insects buzzing around, but what's perhaps more obvious to many people is that the numbers of birds that eat insects that are really doing well. Cuckoos, you hear cuckoos there. I don't know what time you went, but go in the right time in the spring. It's the only place in Sussex now where you can regularly hear cuckoos. You can hear turtle doves. You can hear nightingales, which nightingales are specialist insectivores. Got the second biggest population in the whole of Britain, and they didn't have any nightingales there when they started this project. So it's nice that there is a little ray of hope there. That insects could recover. They're not doomed to continue declining. They'd spring back. Unlike pandas, insects can breed really fast if the conditions are right. They could spring back in no time at all. We just need to set aside enough land to support viable populations long term. And it seems to me, I'm a big fan of rewilding. I'm aware it's quite controversial. It's not everyone's cup of tea, and there are a number of criticisms of it. The most obvious of which is it takes land out of production, and yet we've got a growing human population. How is that going to stack up? Relating to that, it means arguably we're importing more food. If we rewild lots of land in the UK, we'll have to import more, which is exporting the environmental impact of eating. And that's absolutely true, but NEP is on really unproductive clay soils. That they were making a loss. They were receiving huge tax subsidies from the taxpayer and still losing money every year. And essentially, they were about to go broke if they didn't do something, because the land is really hard to farm. It doesn't produce much, and it seems to me that the least productive land that's not viable to farm unless you very heavily subsidise it, which would include quite a lot of the uplands of Britain, would be better used to support nature and carbon capture in the soil and provide recreation for people, places where people can go and connect with nature. One of the lovely things about NEP is that if you go there at the weekend in the spring or summer, there are tens of thousands of people. I mean, it's a bit like Piccadilly Circus, it's perhaps not what you're wanting when you go to a wild place. And from a sort of personal perspective, I might wish there were fewer people there, but actually, isn't that great? Because they're all people that have gone there because they've heard that, they might see a beaver or a stork or a purple emperor butterfly or hear a nightingale. And that they're learning about nature, they're connecting with nature. And if we want to save the planet, we need people to engage with these issues, and what better way than getting them to go somewhere like that. So I think it's brilliant, and personally would love to see a NEP in every county, so that there's one near everybody, and some big projects in the remoter regions of Britain where there's space for them. I would go so far. I mean, I know it's not. Some people would think this was nuts, but I'd love to see wolves back in the UK. They're in pretty much every European country now. Obviously, they can't cross the channel on their own, but they've got wolves in the Netherlands, which is the most crowded, much more crowded than Britain. if there's room for wolves there, then there's room for wolves here.
That might be changing though, because of course Ursula von der Leyen's favourite pony, I think, was killed by some wolves, and now she's on a mission to kill lots of wolves in continental Europe.
There are countries in Europe where, some of the wolves are being shot, but there are more wolves now in Europe than there are in North America, which so overall there are large numbers. And although there are a few instances where it causes problems eating ponies, it's not that common, and it's pretty. I mean, subsidising, paying farmers for their losses, which it's usually sheep is the issue, lambs. Is actually a very small expense compared to the agricultural budget. It's a vanishingly small amount of money, and for the pleasure of having that amazing species that should be here. It's a native species in the UK, and I'd have wild boar and lynx back as well, and beavers everywhere, and pine martens all over the shop, and I'd love to live in a wilder country, basically.
Well, pine martens, or is it polecats? That's happening, right? That's
already happening.
That's why red squirrels are on the way back.
Well, fingers crossed. They are supposed to help because they love to eat a grey squirrel, and that's certainly. Of course, they never went extinct in Britain. There were pine martens in Scotland, and they've recently released some in the New Forest, and then very recently there was some released on Dartmoor. And let's hope they do well and thrive and spread. And wouldn't it be amazing? There'd be something restored from our lost fauna. We live in a country where we've wiped out almost all the large animals. I mean, apart from deer, there are no large wild mammals in Britain at all. And of course, we used to have bears.
Would you want bears back?
Well, it would be nice, wouldn't it? Whether it's practical.
Would it? I don't know.
I think it would. I mean, of course, there are. Not everyone would agree, but just to give an example, I think it's the Abruzzo National Park in Italy is half the size of Cairngorm National Park, but it has wolves and bears and lynx and wildcat and wild boar. That's the whole lot. It has way more people living in it than Cairngorm National Park. So it's not impossible. It's not ridiculous at all. We could have bears, probably, it'd have to be the more remote corners of Britain. And, I guess it's inevitable there would occasionally be conflict if you went down that route. But, I think we need to stop always seeing ourselves as much more important than nature. It seems to me that these species have a right to be here. Maybe I'm a bit crazy.
No, I mean, I personally agree with you, particularly on the wolves thing. We'll come back to that in a moment. But I think lots of people, when they hear a conservationist or somebody, whose political bent is green politics, and they hear somebody saying we should reintroduce wolves, I think they think, well, I'll be going for my walk in, semi-rural Hampshire, and I'll be accosted by...
Yeah, people do think. I mean, obviously, wolves have been done a huge disservice by fairy tales and stories that they don't eat people's grandmothers. They actually, people who live in places where they have wolves, where they've always had wolves, like many parts of lots of countries in Europe. But let's go back to Italy, for example. Most Italian people, even farmers in the countryside, have never seen a wolf. There are plenty of them there, but they're incredibly elusive creatures. They're really shy. They keep away from people. They're not, and they don't attack people. So there are all these ridiculous kind of misunderstandings about wolves, which if we're ever going to introduce them, we need obviously to win people over. You can't do it against the opinion of the large majority of the population. We would have to, bring people around and explain to them that actually, they're not going to have their children snatched from prams or whatever by wolves. That actually, people and wolves can live alongside each other perfectly well.
Well, Chris Packham, he wasn't pro-wolf.
Was he not?
Believe it or not, yeah, I said that to him.
I'm surprised
because obviously he's based in the New Forest, or maybe he's just being sort of canny. And also, he works at the BBC. The last thing he wants is the Daily Express.
Yeah, I'm
you know.
probably not as wise as he is in that respect.
No.
But,
I think the argument should be. Made, but I think I don't see, like you say, Cairngorm seems pretty suitable. I don't see why there aren't wolves in the Highlands.
Well,
and much
there
of
would be
Scotland.
huge benefits if there were, because Scotland is terribly overgrazed by deer. Huge numbers of deer, far more than at any time in history, as far as we can tell. And it means that over great swathes of Scotland, trees can't regenerate at all because the little saplings immediately get eaten. And there's a lot of interest in trying to regrow the Caledonian forests, the sort of, and more broadly the temperate rainforests that used to cover large swathes of Western Wales, Western Scotland, parts of Southwest England. But they can't regenerate because of the deer, and so that you have to put up really expensive fence, 6-8 foot tall fences around any patch of land if you want to grow trees in Scotland. If there were wolves, that's exactly the situation that Yellowstone National Park was in 40 years ago, where they had a huge surplus of deer because there were no predators, because they'd shot all the wolves, and they introduced the wolves, and it had this transformative effect on the whole giant. It's a huge area. And it wasn't so much, actually, it's really interesting. It wasn't so much that the wolf population ate all the deer. The deer population didn't actually fall very much. But their behavior changed. They started keeping out in the open particularly avoiding river valleys with steep sides where wolves found it easier to trap them. So they herd together and stay out in the open, which meant that trees have regenerated in the river valleys, which then provided more food for beavers. So the beaver population rose, which created more wetland, which provided habitat for lots of birds, and so on and so on. So there was this whole cascade of benefits from.
And it even changed the course of rivers, right?
Yeah, it's astonishing. I mean, this terribly overgrazed landscape where the soil was blowing away because there was very little vegetation to hold it together, in a short period of years was transformed with way more wildlife just by putting in. It was somewhere in the region of a dozen wolves they started out with. There's a few more than that now, but still not huge numbers. So imagine having a similar effect in Scotland. It could be absolutely amazing for wildlife, and for carbon capture, because growing more trees means more carbon locked up. And once the wolves were there, they'd do that job forever. So it strikes me as well, yeah, a sort of no-brainer. But then it's easy to say that because I live in the south of England, and I'm sure I would say the same if I lived in Scotland. I did used to live in Scotland, but yeah, perhaps people will think it's not fair for me to be saying you guys, you have wolves. I'd have them in Sussex too, but...
I remember, this is when Ken Livingstone was the mayor of London. I remember they introduced birds of prey to eat some of the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, or at least to get, sort of, for them to sort of vacate that part of the city. And I remember there were these horror stories of like children with their mums, and they would just see all of a sudden this diving bird of prey, and it would be like killing and maiming this pigeon on the floor in front of small children. So the idea that somebody might take their kid to Chessington World of Adventures or something, and on the way see... a dog be maimed by a... Anyway, I personally think it's worth it. Just saying.
Yeah, well, obviously I agree. So we're not going to have an argument over that. But there are many people who wouldn't agree. I think it's highly unlikely that wolves would attack a dog along the side of the road in the way to Chessington. But
the thing that people forget is that also, as you've sort of alluded to, wild animals are incredibly cautious and risk averse, whereas a domesticated dog is far more irrational.
Well, of course, domesticated dogs kill lots of people and maim, and they attack children, and whereas wolves don't do any of those things. They're far safer.
Do you think they're safer than XL bullies?
Oh God, yeah, much more, because wolves don't attack. XL bullies, there've been many instances where they have attacked, but obviously, that tends to be dogs that have been badly treated, badly reared. But it's a pretty regular occurrence where wolves don't do that. They do not just dash out and attack children. They never ever do that. It's not something that is rare. It just doesn't happen. But I think a lot of people probably think it does, because we're brought up with the idea of the wolf as this, it eats all the three little pigs or whatever it is, and Red Riding Hood's gran and all the rest of it. So we think that they'll attack people as as a sort of a prey item, but they don't. It's nonsense.
The thing, this touches on is, of course, this term, this extraordinary idea, not an idea, it's an empirical reality, of trophic cascade. And this idea that, you introduce this species and it has all these sort of knock-ons and feedbacks. And the paradigmatic example is, of course, the wolf in Yellowstone. And I think there's some evidence as well in Canada, I think, I might be wrong, with helping to renew boreal sort of forests and woodland up there. And it's really interesting because, of course, in the last few weeks, we've had Labour announce this 22 billion pounds that will be going towards carbon capture. And you think, if McKinsey could make money and people could patent wolves, beavers, trees, we would have all of them.
Yes.
Because of carbon capture. But the big problem for those guys is they're free. Nobody makes any money from reintroducing
a tree growing.
wolves.
Yeah. No, it's. I was gutted when I saw that big announcement last week. I still have high hopes for our new government, but they're lower than they were. Well, it seemed like they were likely to be a big improvement. I hoped. And broadly, the idea of a green energy company seemed like a sensible one, but I strongly disapprove of the idea that carbon capture is the way forward. It's just an excuse for carrying on burning fossil fuels, as far as I can see, and a way, as you say, for people to make money. You can make lots of money by building giant machines, but it's essentially unproven technology. Nobody knows whether it can really be done at the scale required to actually make the slightest impact on climate change. When we have natural systems that can trap huge amounts of carbon, the soil and trees, but as you say, they're hard to monetize. So we're going down the carbon capture route instead, which is just idiot. Aside from anything else, a focus on reducing energy consumption is what we really need. Things like insulating homes, that should be first thing on your list if you're worried about sustainability of energy supplies. Reduce the amount of energy you use in the first place. But again, it's hard to profit from reducing energy consumption. So yeah, disappointing, I have to say. But there's been a tidal wave of objections on Twitter and other social media, I've noticed. I don't know whether anyone in Labour HQ is listening, but I like to think that there might be somebody.
It's also hard to make people feel guilty about it, and this is something that probably my biggest disappointment with green politics and green movements over the last, over my lifetime, but over the last 20 years, is this obsession with aviation. I'm not pro-aviation, I'm just saying aviation, cars, recycling. And it's really fascinating for me because when I talk to conservatives who aren't climate deniers, but they're like, well, actually, human interest should come first. I'll say, well, look, we can do things like if we stop eating fish, if we just left the oceans alone, and you all of a sudden allowed, a greater proliferation of things like beluga whales, blue whales, these extraordinary carbon-sucking machines. Maybe actually, if we did that, if we said as a species, we're no longer going to eat fish, maybe you can still fly, relatively often. And that's a trade-off we can discuss as a culture, as a civilization. And they're like, wow, I never knew that a whale is basically a carbon sequestration machine, which of course it is. And things like beavers, wolves are effectively infrastructure, right? They're infrastructure. If we want a lower carbon society, if we want to reduce concentrations of CO2 in our atmosphere, which is the highest they've been for 10 million years, they're the highest we think. I wasn't here 10 million years ago. That's the sort of carbon record. They're higher than at any point in the history of primate species, we think. A big part of that is really cheap, easy stuff. And actually, when you say that to people on the right, they go, okay. So it doesn't mean that actually we have to give up all the things I like. Of course, you'll have to give up some of them. You might have to do some of them less. But there's also lots of really low-hanging fruit. I feel anyway. That's something that really bugs me. And I feel like the green movement generally has failed to communicate that?
Yeah, I guess it's a slightly different tack, but it seems to me that livestock is another issue that doesn't get anywhere near enough attention. That, you know, there's this incredible statistic that that 96% of all the biomass of mammals on the planet is made up of our livestock and us. I think 60% cow, so cow, sheep, pig, and 36% human, which means that all the wild animals, including the whales, together weigh 4%. It's just staggering. But it just illustrates how many cows and other ruminants we have, all of them with huge carbon footprints. And so, you know, if we just ate a bit less meat, and particularly red meat, it's a really easy win. You know, you're not necessarily asking people to go vegan or vegetarian even, but we could all greatly reduce our footprint by halving our meat consumption, for example, which then, as you say, would make it much easier to reach net zero.
Are you a veggie?
I can't resist cheese, so I've never managed to go vegan, but I'm more or less veggie. The odd relapse every now and again. But my son is vegan and endlessly badgers me to be vegan, so I keep trying. So who knows whether I'll make it full vegan in the end, but I do occasionally weaken and have a chicken burger.
What do you think of the argument that actually meat is kind of important for human health? And I can already see the comments in response to me saying that the vegans saying, "How dare you?" But I mean, I'll give you an example. After my wife suffered a miscarriage, we now have a daughter. You know, she was instructed to eat as much iron as possible, and they were saying, obviously, we can give you iron supplements. She was given an iron supplement. She lost a tremendous amount of blood, but they also said try and eat lots of offal, right? And that strikes me as quite an important indicator that actually some of these things are quite even necessary actually for human function. We have no longitudinal study of any society anywhere ever where multiple generations aren't eating some kind of meat product. So maybe actually there is an argument for the health thing, no?
I mean, of course, historically, when we were wandering around as hunter-gatherers, we ate meat and eggs and you know, the like. Probably not very much most of the time, and it would have varied enormously. You know, in some areas we were primarily hunters. Probably in you know, when we moved up into Siberia, for example, trailing mammoths, then those people were probably nearly 100% carnivores. But while we were in Africa, we would have primarily been eating leaves, tubers, berries, and so on, supplemented occasionally by you know, an animal if you managed to catch it. It's pretty clear you can eat healthily without eating meat, I think. You know, there are iron, for example. There are plenty of sources of vegetarian sources of iron, green vegetables and nuts and so on. But you do need to eat a lot of them, more than people typically do. But you know, my son is vegan. He's 23. He's just done a degree in nutrition. He's been vegan for 4 years now. He's also into climbing and weightlifting, and he looks pretty healthy on it. And he, you know, would tell you at great length that you don't need to eat meat to be healthy and have a fully balanced diet. But it's not easy. You have to make much more effort with your cooking.
I would also say as well, another counter, because I find this really interesting, is that, I mean, that's all true. You know, you can eat lots of different fruit and veg and you can cover all your bases. But if we're saying that we need to eat more seasonally in somewhere like the Northern Hemisphere, then I simply don't see how all of one's calories can come from that kind of diet. I mean, that rests on the presumption that you'll have globalized supply chains for food. I mean, you know, whereas actually in the north of the Northern Hemisphere, things that eat grass tend to be quite a decent source of calories.
So the notion that we should eat local is slightly inaccurate in that if food can be transported by ship or overland, then the carbon footprint associated is really quite small. It's only really air freighted foodstuffs that we should be avoiding, because that is a big carbon footprint. But things like bananas that come by boat, The carbon footprint of shipping, because you can transport thousands of tons in one boat, the per banana carbon footprint is really tiny.
But then you've got things like refrigeration.
Even allowing for all of that, there's a really good website, Our World in Data, which clearly you're familiar with. Hannah Ritchie is one of the main people at Oxford University that created it, and that will give you facts and figures for exactly what the carbon footprint associated with transport is for products from different parts of the world and so on, compared to the carbon footprint of all the other aspects of their production. And generally speaking, if it's coming by sea, then more than 90% of the carbon footprint is how it was grown in the first place, not the shipping cost. Really? Everyone's surprised by that. But if you don't believe me, look at the figures.
So Natalie Bennett, a Green Lord, who recently said we should only have fresh strawberries, or maybe we should only have fresh strawberries a few months a year.
Strawberries, she's right, because they're air freighted. You can't ship strawberries by boat. So any soft fruit, things like grapes, strawberries, raspberries, and so on, we definitely should eat seasonally, or frozen. It's fine if they've been frozen. But yes, there's a cost with that, but it's not that great. So there's a lot of misconceptions there. You can eat stuff from the tropics without feeling guilty if it came over land or sea and not by plane.
As long as it's not soft fruit.
As long as it's not perishable in the short term, basically, which means soft fruit primarily.
Okay, that's good to know. I've learned something. I've learned lots, but that's something I didn't expect. Let's go back to pesticides, because we've talked about neonicotinoids.
Mm-hmm.
Glyphosate. I mean, you said that you're hopeful with Labour. One of the worrying things for me with Labour actually is that they reintroduced in Brighton, which is your neck of the woods, they reintroduced the use of glyphosate in the city.
Yeah.
So can you explain what glyphosate is and why it's bad?
Okay. Glyphosate's a herbicide. It's the active ingredient in Roundup, is what it's usually known as. And you can buy it in supermarkets, garden centres, anywhere these days. It's a systemic herbicide. You put it on a plant and it's absorbed into the plant and it spreads to the roots and it kills the plant. It's an very effective herbicide.
Is that the thing that makes them look yellow?
Yeah.
Right.
It's not the only one that makes them yellow, but usually, because it's the most used pesticide in the world by far, it's usually the herbicide used in parks and city streets and by gardeners and by farmers. So it's an effective herbicide. It helps farmers grow crops. It clears the field before they plant their crops, and it's commonly used in amenity areas to, if you've got a drive with weeds poking up, the easiest way to get rid of the weeds is to spray it with glyphosate. But it's become quite clear. I was taught, and to be fair, I believed for years that glyphosate broke down as soon as it touched the soil, that it wasn't persistent. It turns out that isn't true. I believed foolishly that it was harmless to anything that wasn't a plant. Turns out that that's not true. So in recent years, a number of studies have shown that it's quite persistent in soil, that it's really toxic to fungi that live in the soil. And we are increasingly aware that things like mycorrhiza, the fungi that are symbiotic with plant roots, that help to link up trees and are used for communication between trees and to absorb nutrients and so on, that they're badly affected by glyphosate. It's toxic to bees, or at least as formulated in Roundup, it's toxic to bees. And the World Health Organization declared in 2013 that it's a probable carcinogen in people. That remains hugely controversial because it's hotly disputed by, was Monsanto. Monsanto were bought relatively recently by Bayer, but it's their biggest selling product. So obviously they don't want people to believe it gives them cancer, but there's pretty good evidence that it does. There've been some big court cases in the US. most of which have gone the way of the plaintiff. So there've been some big payoffs. The first of which was a guy. So it's been linked to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, particularly exposure by people who are exposed regularly to glyphosate. So typically people who are spraying it rather than other folk. And so a school groundskeeper who got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma took Monsanto to court and got, I think it was $2.5–3 billion payout. There've been a few other court cases. They haven't all gone that way. But anyway, there's sufficient evidence. If the World Health Organization says it's a probable carcinogen, it seems to me it would be sensible to avoid it where possible. And yet, you see it being sprayed in parks. I've seen it being sprayed on children's play equipment in parks. If you screen the urine of people, there was a big study done in Germany where they looked for glyphosate in people's urine, and more than 99% of the people they tested, and it was a big sample of a few thousand people, contained glyphosate, with more in the children's urine than in the adults, which is concerning to say the least. And it seems to me that, yet again, it's a chemical that we should be restricting or doing away with completely. It certainly shouldn't be being sprayed on things we're going to eat. So the reason it's in urine is if you test bread or anything that's made from grain, the grain crops are typically sprayed with glyphosate just before harvest to make them die and dry at a time that can be controlled by the farmer. So very often a field of wheat will be sprayed, and then a week later it'll be harvested, and the grain will go off to be turned into bread or cereal or biscuits or whatever. So they all contain glyphosate. So it's in our diet.
Effectively, all wheat will have non-organic.
Most non-organic grain crops will contain glyphosate. And so an enormous number of things, and even things you'd think would be quite healthy, like Quaker's Oats breakfast porridge, that particular brand has turns out has quite high levels of glyphosate in it. But lots of others do too. There's no point in singling them out. It's everywhere. So half the supermarket's full of glyphosate. That doesn't seem like a great situation. It's unclear whether the doses in food are sufficient to be something we should be worried about. But then we have a very poor understanding of what lifetime exposure can do to us, because nobody studies that. None of the safety tests that are done on pesticides involve exposing someone for years. Well, they don't involve people at all, of course. They typically involve a rodent like a rat, usually being exposed for a few days or weeks at most. And you see, is it alive or dead at the end of it? What's happening with us humans now is from the day we're conceived until the day we die, we're being exposed not just to glyphosate, but to a whole cocktail of different pesticides. And we have no idea what the long-term exposure effects are.
No idea.
No idea at all. I say that. There have been some studies which show that people who eat organic food are less likely to develop certain cancers, for example. But those studies are never perfect, because people who eat more organic food also do other things that are different. They're probably more health conscious. They're probably from a different socioeconomic class than average. And it's really hard to disentangle all of these things. So it's the evidence could be disputed, but there is evidence that if you go out of your way to minimize your pesticide exposure, you'll live longer, basically. And perhaps that shouldn't come as a great surprise, really, when you think about it.
It strikes me as insane that farmers will routinely spray crops with glyphosate a week before.
Yeah, well, it sounds daft, and obviously from a food residue point of view, it is daft.
Yeah.
But it's a really handy tool for the farmer, because he can ensure that the crop desiccates. If there's a forecast that there's going to be dry weather for the next 10 days, but the crop isn't quite ready, isn't naturally drying off, You spray it with glyphosate, the crop dies and dries, and then you can harvest it before the dry period ends. So it gives the farmer more control over when he can harvest and avoid bad weather for harvesting. So it's quite, you can see why they do it. It's it's a practical consideration, but it means that just before it goes off for food production, the crop is being treated with a persistent pesticide, which will therefore end up in our breakfast cereal or whatever.
But what frustrates me, and it's something that I encounter so much in this country, is you'll say we need to ban something like glyphosate, and then there'll be the example of these plants basically sort of cropping up through the pavement. And people say this is bad. By the way, actually, I think in some instances it can be bad. I think it can obstruct. I've seen it obstructing, a path for a wheelchair or a pram. But cities, municipalities dealt with that for a really long time before we had glyphosate. You can just use a trowel or a jet wash or whatever. There's a panoply of other solutions. But it's just this mad mindset, which is either we use this possibly quite lethal thing, lethal for certain species, less so for us, but probably quite dangerous, or we do nothing. And it's like,
there are lots of
stuff going on,
alternatives.
perhaps,
I mean, as you rightly point out, glyphosate wasn't available until 1976, I think. So we managed perfectly well for hundreds of years without it. And there's some quite high-tech solutions. One of which is a hot foam system that basically you spray this. It's based on a natural plant extract, the foaming agent, and you basically cook the weeds by encasing them in a layer of hot foam. It costs a few grand to buy the machine, which is an obstacle for councils who are obviously money strapped at the moment. But there are a completely different approach is for local residents to occasionally have a little work party to go out and hoe off the weeds just in front of their own homes, and there are plenty of examples of people doing that. It seems a bit daft to resort to something that might give us cancer for the sake of being tidy. The other thing is, I agree completely. There are instances where tall weeds on a pavement are not ideal. They're for people with limited mobility, they could be a real problem, but they're not that hard to deal with. But there are lots of other instances where actually the vegetation was doing no harm to anybody. A classic is the little patches of soil around the bases of street trees, which are are not part of the pavement. People don't walk through that patch normally, and I've seen those being sprayed off, and there was just a little bit of vegetation growing around the base of the tree, doing no harm to anybody. But then it's killed. Why?
Because my wife's a counsellor. She's the group leader. She's the Labour group leader in Portsmouth, where we live. And as you can imagine, I talk about this stuff with her a lot. She said council officers where she lives are adamant that having vegetation around the tree will kill the tree. And I said
that is just bonkers. Isn't it?
I know. I said what's the saying about the thorn, the thistle being the mother of the oak, brambles being the mother of the oak. Basically,
it was you. So that brings me back to NEP. One really interesting feature of NEP is that you see tussocks of bramble and blackthorn and hawthorn.
Yeah.
Like they look almost like Daleks, these kind of rounded mounds, which are nibbled by the grazing animals, but because of the thorns, they slowly grow.
Yeah.
And then when it gets big enough, you'll see a little oak sapling coming up through the middle, and it's just once the thorn bush is wide enough that the cattle can't reach things poking through the middle, the little tree manages to grow and gets above the height of the cows, and then you've got a tree regenerating. Completely, fascinating and a process that you can't see anywhere else in Britain. It must have happened for thousands of years, but we don't allow scrub like that to develop anymore generally. Anyway, shows very clearly that even a little sapling can grow through a great thicket of dense bramble and whatnot, let alone a little bit of, a full-size tree is not going to be harmed by a little bit of grass around the bottom.
Fake news. If you're a Portsmouth council officer, fake news, I'm afraid, Dave.
Yeah.
Well. I mean, this is when I sort of my inner Farage comes out, or my inner Maggie Thatcher. I'm a socialist, but if I was like the city mayor and there was a council officer that said, I'm going to get cancelled for this, and a council officer said that, I would say, we need to have a sort of re-education program for people like you. Otherwise, you will be fired. Like, it's insane that you have people paid money by council taxpayers who are that ignorant about something so important. The plants would kill the tree. What are you talking? Where do they recruit these people?
Yeah. There is a general issue, which is sort of, this reminds me of, which is that the people in positions of, in decision-making positions in this country, politicians at all levels, very few of them have any scientific knowledge at all. And you look at it, look at MPs, only a handful of them have any kind of science degree. One or two of them have a degree in biology. It does worry me that we have a really, the people making really important decisions don't have a good grounding in the basics underlying that decision. Which might bring me back to things like the carbon capture idea. I think Keir Starmer's possibly doing his best, but I don't think he knows much about the actual evidence surrounding climate change and how best to deal with it. I strongly suspect the other people in his cabinet don't either. We don't give enough. Perhaps the scientists would say this, but I wish they would listen more to the scientific evidence. It seems that very often decisions are made without actually consulting anyone who really knows what they're talking about. Which is daft, particularly because Britain, we're awash with good scientists. We have great universities still, despite their troubles, with lots of, the top ecologists, top climate scientists in the world, and yet most of them no politician ever talks to, which is kind of frustrating.
It was really interesting, actually. I want to go back as well to that phenomenon of how few politicians come from a natural sciences background, and how we teach natural sciences in this country more broadly. That's really interesting. You talk about that in Sun and Earth, but also you talk in your most recent book, or almost your most recent book. You've got a new one coming out, or it's just come out.
Just come out.
The one before that, you talk about this experience of going to Parliament, and you're going to talk about bees and pesticides and whatnot, and you're expecting the good and the great, dozens of MPs to turn up. But in the end, it's a sort of motley crew of what, a dozen sort of junior staffers and advisors. And
well, what was worse was, I think it was organised by 38 Degrees, and they told me they'd got 80 MPs signed up that were going to come and listen to me to give them a pitch about the importance of bees and insects and why we need to look after them and all that stuff. Which I thought, brilliant. This is exactly, I've been complaining that politicians don't listen to scientists. Anyway, I went along, and most of the seats in front of me were empty, apart from a few junior folk with notebooks who were obviously been sent to report back. But many MPs did turn up, but all they did, there was a big banner with a picture of a bee on it and 38 Degrees logo on it. They queued up to have their photo taken in front of the banner, and then they buggered off. And while they were queuing up, they were all chattering to each other, not listening to me at all. So I couldn't actually make myself heard to even the people taking notes who were sitting down. It was just, really frustrating and bloody annoying, frankly, and showed no respect at all. Why invite someone along and then just talk over them and ignore them? So quite disheartening, really.
That's modern politics. They just take selfies. They take selfies, and anyway, I could talk all day about that stuff. But the interesting contrast for me, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, is that I was speaking to Olivia Chung last week, and she is a scholar of Xi Jinping and China. And she was saying that the Politburo will pretty regularly be briefed by top scientists on things like the latest in EV technology, solid batteries, biodiversity, rewilding. Now, I'm not suggesting it's all good or that they necessarily listen, but this idea of a top scientist, maybe on a weekly basis, briefing the most powerful people in the country. And I'm thinking, I'm sure they do sometimes, but why doesn't Cabinet do that?
very good question. I wasn't aware that China did, but good for them.
It seems sensible.
It seems eminently sensible. As I say, we have all this expertise on tap, and I don't know a single scientist who wouldn't be absolutely over the moon and very happy to go along for free to impart whatever knowledge they have to politicians, any politician that would listen. But we never get very rarely get the opportunity. It seems like a huge opportunity missed.
So you come across as a very serene man, quite calm.
I try. Yeah,
you try. Well, as somebody who's, I'm half Iranian, so I don't want to feed into sort of racial stereotypes, but I think I've got a bit of hot-headedness from my father. You come across as a sort of very, calm, serene, Englishman with his nice garden. He's making his cider on YouTube. But then I read your book, and you're basically talking about, civilizational collapse. And there's even a chapter, which is a sort of speculative fiction set in the future, maybe 80, 100 years from now, talking about something that looks like, Cormac McCarthy, The Road. It's the end of the world as we know it. So are we heading for civilizational collapse, given the things that you've written about, studied, about insects, collapsing food supplies, etc.? What's your view? If I said, Dave, your house depends on it, as a betting man, how likely is it?
I think we are. I'm always hesitant to say this because you sound like that, the crazy guy on the street corner with the placard, the end is nigh. But I think probably it's very hard to predict with certainty. I'm getting in my caveats before I tell you what I think. Obviously, things like AI could be a complete game changer in either direction. Very, very hard to predict, impossible to predict. But what's happening in terms of climate collapse, climate chaos, I should say, and biodiversity collapse makes me think that, and the ramifications of those events for society, flooding of low-lying areas, climate becoming unsuitable for survival, really, in large chunks near the equator. I think we're going to see massive global upheaval. We're going to see hundreds of millions of people displaced, way, way more. People are concerned about a few thousand people trying to cross the channel at the moment. I think it's going to be infinitely worse. And that's just one of many other problems we're creating. I think the current social system the current society is going to crumble. It's probably not instantly, and it'll be a more of a slow decline than a sudden crash. But all the signs are there. And I, maybe it sounds ridiculous, but I try to work out how me and the family would survive if we had to grow all our own food. And I have plans to make sure that we can feed ourselves if we have to. And it's kind of crazy that I'm thinking like that, but it seems to me wise to, at the very least, think about it, and take some small steps to prepare. I haven't gone down the full sort of prepper mode yet.
There's not a bunker in.
There's no bunker yet. So, but I would say that because if I did have a bunker, I wouldn't want you to rush around and jump in when the time comes. But no, I haven't quite gone that far. But yeah, and people think this is nuts. How can civilization come to an end? And I think the obvious riposte to that is, well, every other civilization came to an end, and the people in it at the time would have never guessed it was good. Roman Empire was incredible. And if someone had said to someone in the midst of, at the height of the Roman Empire, this whole thing is going to collapse and you're going to be invaded by tribes from the north and there'll be nothing left at all in 200 years, they would have laughed. They would have said that's ridiculous. But that's what happened. Simple, likewise with every other civilization we've seen so far. So why are we really that different? I mean, of course, the circumstances are different. It's a global civilization now. We've got all sorts of technologies at our disposal. but many of them are not necessarily positive technologies. We can also do terrible harm very quickly with some of the technology available to us. I think we're in trouble, personally. It's going to be a really interesting few decades, and I don't know how much of it I'll live to see, but I try to make my kids sort of think ahead and plan as to how they might get through tricky times. I think we certainly can't look forward to, life expectancy increasing, our children all being better off than we were, which is what we've had for hundreds of years. I think we're going in the other direction now, sadly.
What's interesting is you spoke about the Roman Empire. One of the hypotheses for the collapse of the Roman Empire isn't actually the sacking of Rome, which happens multiple times, or developments in its frontiers in what was called Germania. One of the big hypotheses is actually Vandal invasions of Spain, which was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. So instability in food supply is actually what destroyed the imperial core. And when you think about that, it's kind of worrying, because that is broadly speaking what's predicted with regards to collapsing biodiversity and climate change. The big issue will be these globalized food supply chains that we've become accustomed to. And I don't even think, is collapse even the right word? Because I do think it's very possible that in high GDP Western countries, we will see deurbanization this century, because it's just very, very hard to maintain those concentrations of people. And I think you may see an uptick. So right now in the UK, about 1% of the population or less actually works in agriculture. I think you'll probably see an uptick in that. It might be 3, 4, 5%. And you can imagine those things being celebrated, and maybe they should be celebrated, deurbanization, more labour in agriculture. But actually that in essence would be a sign that civilizational model has kind of been broken with. So I do wonder what would collapse. I mean, like you say, there's arguments to say that, it's already here in terms of median life expectancy. It's already stagnated for the best part of 15 years. So that is a really interesting one for me. And I think you're right that, civilizations come to an end. The sort of image I have in my mind is a place called Merv in Central Asia. I think it's in Uzbekistan. At one point, one of the most prosperous, advanced, populated cities on earth. There's literally nothing there now, partly because of Genghis Khan and the Mongols. But, there's nothing to say our cities one day won't resemble that. So that's the scale of the challenge. Do you think that democratic politics is capable of stopping that, mitigating it, creating solutions?
It doesn't seem to be, based on what's happened so far. There are clearly many failings with the systems we have, whatever variant of democracy you have. I mean, in the UK, the most recent elections, the fact that there's only really two choices, and you might not like either of them, but there really isn't any point voting for anyone else because they're not going to win, is a fundamental flaw, and means that the Green Party, for example, has no real future under the current system.
Do you think, even with 4 MPs?
But 4 MPs doesn't actually give them any power at all, does it?
Well, they've gone from 1 to 4. They could feasibly get 20 in 10 years' time. That they could be in a coalition.
But yeah, possibly. But look at the Lib Dems. They're the greenest of the main 3 parties, but they never really had any power for decades, have they? I mean, yes, they had their brief moment in the coalition, and look how that went. But one of the other terrible problems that I think we face is at the heart of it is the growing global inequality, the distribution of wealth, which means that increasingly we see individual people with huge power and influence, which exceeds that of countries. Democracy doesn't work when you've got Elon Musk putting hundreds of millions of pounds into supporting a particular politician, and therefore potentially distorting, democracy for their own purposes. That's really alarming, and at the root of many other problems that society has. I think that while a small number of tiny proportion of the population is sequestering most of the resources, and there are huge numbers of people that are living on or below the poverty line. The resentment that causes is vast. It's not stable long term, and I think that underlies a lot of the unrest and anger that you see. The rioting and so on in Europe in recent years. So that I don't know what the solution is. I wish I had a solution on how to fix it. I love the idea of kind of the community assemblies that might help to inform political decision making, but there doesn't seem to be any real appetite for, citizens' assemblies, I should say. Doesn't really seem to be any appetite from mainstream politicians to take that seriously. There's also the endless issue of sort of lobbying and corruption of politicians. Having experienced the power of big industries personally, in the pesticide saga that I talked about earlier, many of the decisions politicians make seem to be decisions made to benefit large industries rather than the actual people of the country, often international industries rather than the people that are supposed to be being served by democratically elected politicians. We all know that lobbying is rife in one, and it's very clever the way it operates. The big companies spend hundreds of millions of pounds trying to corrupt the decision-making process of politicians. That's what a lobbyist does. And while that is happening, I can't really see how democracy can properly function. But we seem to be a million miles from a situation where you could plausibly say we need to end lobbying in some way. But unless we do, I don't see how we can end up in making the right decisions, personally.
Well, I suppose the argument is you'd move towards a model more like China. And I don't mean everything about China, but the idea that you perhaps... There's two routes, isn't there? I mean, I think for the European context, I just think proportional representation would make such a difference in this country. Because I think, the idea that electoral cycles, 5 years Labour come in, they'll invest in the NHS, then the Tories come in, they'll defund the NHS ad infinitum. But if you have PR and you have to build coalitions, I feel like you would start to get a perspective of 20 years rather than 2 minutes.
It would certainly be a big step in the right direction. And, I guess it's plausible that Labour might give us another vote at some point, but it's certainly not high on their list of priorities, is it? I don't think they're going to do it in the next 5 years. Maybe if they win the next election, they might get around to thinking about it. I think everyone recognises that the system doesn't really work at the moment. And the fact that we ended up with a Labour landslide when actually the number of votes they got was not that big a proportion of the population, shows there's something wrong. People aren't being properly represented. At the moment, that suited Labour, but next time round, it could just as easily suit the Tories. If Reform and the Conservatives merged together, they could win a landslide. And as you say, we then just go flip-flop backwards and forwards. And really, in terms of building up the infrastructure, of saving the NHS and so on, we never get anywhere. Certainly I agree about PR. That would help, but I don't think on its own that's going to solve all of our problems.
What's really interesting though is because you sound, I don't know if you've heard this term before, black-pilled. There's black pills. There's the red and the blue pill, in Matrix, but you're the black pill, which is like we're kind of buggered. But on the one hand, you're quite black-pilled about the broader political process. By the way, so am I. Many people are. I don't even think that's a particularly left thing. I think that's even people on the right say politics isn't working, which is interesting because of course people on the left say, well, you're getting everything you want, and then the right say, well, you're getting everything you want. It's fascinating. But then when it comes to the personal sphere, you have very much an activist can-do sort of mindset that we are part of the solution. And you talk a lot about gardens.
Indeed.
So what can I do? I mean, I have a small garden in Portsmouth. It's a very densely populated place. But, it's big enough to do some things. What can I do in a small to medium-sized garden to help insects and pollinators and biodiversity?
Lots, but actually, before I launch into that, I should say that I strongly believe that we shouldn't get so depressed about all the terrible things going on in the world that we give up, because if we do give up, then the game really is up. We're gonna, things are going to be awful. It's not a win-lose situation, is it? With things like tackling climate change, if we're clearly not going to prevent 1.5 degrees of warming. We're almost at 1.5 degrees. We're probably realistically 2 would be an amazing result if we managed to keep it below that. But every fraction of a degree of warming that we avoid is much better than if we just give up. So, 2 degrees would be a lot better than 2.1 degrees, which is a lot better than 2.2 degrees, and so on. So it isn't that, things aren't going well, so we should just abandon all hope and stop worrying about it. We have to fight every step of the way. Is that every bit of carbon that stays in the ground, every species that we stop from going extinct is a triumph, is a win compared to losing that species. So, there's every motive to carry on to the end, fighting to try and salvage as much as possible as we can. And one way you can do that is in your own garden, because it's really easy to get despondent and, with all the difficulties the world faces and think, there's nothing I can do about climate change and there's nothing I can do about biodiversity loss. Well, actually there is if you've got a garden. Even if you haven't got a garden, there are things you can do, of course. But if you have got a garden, you can support an amazing number of species. There's this really lovely example from Leicester. There's this lady, Jenny Owen, who I suspect sadly might be dead by now. She's certainly very, very old if she's still alive. But she did this amazing thing. She had a little urban garden and she spent 35 years cataloguing every species of anything she could find in her garden. She wrote a book about it. And her species list was after 35 years, was 2,673 different species. Most of them insects, but there were all sorts of birds, spiders, plants, worms, and everything. I just think that's, so thousands of species in a little 1/8 of an acre urban garden. Leicester's not famous for its biodiversity, so we can all have thousands of species in our garden. And one garden's not going to do a fat lot on its own, but there are 22 million private gardens in the UK or thereabouts. And collectively they cover something like 400,000 hectares of land. So, my sort of optimistic dream is we get most of those being managed for nature in a nature-friendly way. And that would be a really big win. That would provide a kind of nationwide network of patches of wildlife-friendly habitat. And it's really easy to do. And I mean, I guess excitingly as well, there are lots of people doing it already. There's lots of people who are keen to garden for wildlife, or sometimes called garden rewilding. And I think the reality is they're one and the same, really. But the simple things like not using any pesticides in your garden, reducing how often you mow the lawn, plant some native wildflowers, put up a little bee hotel, be a bit more tolerant of weeds, things like dandelions and so on. All stuff and don't be too tidy. Don't deadhead at the end of the summer, as people often do.
Don't deadhead at the end of the summer?
Yeah, leave the dead stems through the winter, because there's loads of hibernating little insects. There's seeds in the dead seed heads for the goldfinches will come and feed on. Tidying it away, and worst of all, chopping off the dead heads and burning them. You're killing all those little critters and getting rid of the seeds. So ideally wait till late winter, early spring, when the insects that are hibernating there are starting to wake up and when the goldfinches have already eaten all the seeds. Then you can chop it down and allow room for the fresh growth to come through.
So let's say I've got some hanging petunias outside my front door.
They're going to die anyway over the winter.
Yeah, sure. I've been deadheading them all year.
Yeah.
And there are some deadheads now.
Yeah.
What should I mean, you're saying they're going to die anyway.
If you're just taking off the flower buds, the petunias don't produce seeds that birds eat anyway. Yeah. So that, feel free to tidy away those. But what I'm thinking more of, if you've got herbaceous plants, Things like lavenders and catmints and Michaelmas daisies and so on, that often grow, perhaps a metre tall, and there'll be lots, and it all dies off back down to ground level in the autumn, and you're left with these sort of stems and shriveled leaves and flower heads. Just leave them, ideally. They look a little, it comes down to a kind of aesthetic. If you want your garden to look super tidy, then that's why people clear them away. But there's no need for that tidying, and it's harmful to wildlife that otherwise is using that resource. So generally try not to be too kind of overly tidy. Things like raking leaves, that's bonkers. Why do people, or even worse, bloody leaf blowers? I mean, I never understood the point of blowing leaves from one point to another, because they're going to blow back again as soon as the wind blows. But raking up leaves, if you leave them on the ground, worms will pull them into the ground and eat them, and that'll release the nutrients.
Your grass will all die.
It won't.
It won't.
No, it'll increase the fertility of the soil and make the grass grow better.
But if you have very little solar exposure and you have lots of leaves, then obviously the grass isn't going to.
Well, if you've got lots of big trees, you're not going to have a good lawn anyway, because there's not going to be enough light getting through in the summer. And go into a woodland, you don't see lots of grass growing under the trees. So you've got probably.
So let's go back to my garden, right?
Okay.
That's exactly the issue in my garden. We do have a lawn. It's just about manages. It's a squeezed lawn, in the words of Ed Miliband in 2014, just about managing. But what you're saying is perhaps actually it would make more sense for my garden to not have a lawn.
Yeah, lawns are a bit of a waste of space. From a wildlife perspective, a lawn has very little value. A wildflower meadow, which you might cut once or twice a year and is full of flowers, is great for wildlife. But the traditional mown lawn is usually got very little botanical diversity, and because you mow it all the time, nothing flowers, even if there are any flowers in it. And it essentially serves, from a wildlife's perspective, has very little value at all. So generally speaking, having less lawn and more flower beds and shrubs and trees and so on is better for wildlife.
Where do I walk? So on the two sides, you've got a green gauge plum. You've got that. You've got what's the name of the thing called? It's a very old fruit. It's a Victorian fruit which nobody likes, and you have to put them in a brown paper bag, and then you can eat them after a few weeks. No.
Medlars.
But medlars. Yeah, it's a medlar, which my dad loves them for some reason. Anyway, fine. So I've got medlar, green gauge. We've got some roses. They're bad. Okay, we'll get back to that in a moment. But then through the middle, you've got a lawn. But you're basically saying I should turn the middle bit into a wildflower meadow. But then how do I walk around? Do I walk through the
cut a path is fine if you need a path, or just reduce the lawn to a strip that you walk along.
Right.
Right. If you don't want to wade through long wet grass, which is understandable. But the less lawn, the better from a wildlife perspective. And if you find that the leaves are smothering the grass, then just rake them onto the flower beds next to it, rather than raking them into a big pile and burning them, as some people do. Because the nutrients in those leaves are really important to go back into the soil, which is where they came from in the first place. Choosing plants, generally speaking, avoid double flowers, things like the classic kind of hybrid rose, which is just this bundle of petals with no middle. Many flowers are mutant. Many of the double flowers on sale, they're actually weird mutants that where the anthers, which are the sort of male parts of the flower that produce pollen, have mutated into an extra set of petals. So you see things like double varieties of hollyhocks and cherries and aquilegias, all sorts of things. They have more petals, so people think they look prettier, but from a bee's perspective, there's no pollen, so they're completely useless. So sticking to single varieties of roses can be great for wildlife, but just the single varieties with a nice open flower with just a ring of 5 petals and the anthers and pollen, producing pollen in the middle. And generally old-fashioned cottage garden kind of flowers, things like lavender and hollyhock and foxgloves, comfrey, rosemary, thyme, lots of herbs, chives, are all really good for bees, and some of them you can cook with as well. There's lots of choice of beautiful plants you can grow. A wildlife garden can look really pretty. It doesn't have to be a shambolic mess of nettles and brambles, as some people imagine. It can look absolutely stunning. But as well as having pretty flowers, you've got the extra dimension of bees and butterflies and birdsong and all the rest of it, which for me brings it all to life. And I think kids should grow up in a world where they see insects and other wildlife, so they don't end up frightened of bees and wasps when they encounter them. I think we should try and sort of turn our cities into oases for nature. Maybe wolves would be going a step too far in the middle of London, but certainly, there's no reason why we can't have thousands of species of insect living right in our cities, in our parks and gardens and so on.
So I presume for the same reason you said about roses, peonies, bad?
So I saw there's a Kew Gardens. They were growing a single variety of peony, and it was absolutely covered in bees. I've always said the peonies were rubbish for insects, and they generally are. The ones that are this great mass of petals are absolutely useless. But the original wild peony, which is what they were growing at Kew Gardens, it was absolutely smothered in bees. So if you can find those, they're not so easy to get.
Geraniums bad.
Pelargoniums. So
that's good.
This is important. Well, it's not that important, but it's important to me. People get really confused. They call what we often call geraniums are actually pelargoniums. They're related to geraniums, but they're from South Africa. The things that people often have in hanging baskets and pots and whatnot, really colourful, usually pink or white. They're rubbish for our native bees because they can't reach the nectar. They're designed to be pollinated by weird long-tongued flies that live in South Africa. But geraniums, proper geraniums, which are hardy perennial plants that grow in clumps and often usually have purple or pink flowers. Many of those there are lots of native geraniums, and most varieties of proper geranium are actually pretty good for wildlife.
Fuchsia?
Flower for ages as well. Fuchsias aren't terrible, but they're not amongst the best. Though if I was giving you top tips for insect-friendly plants, I probably wouldn't include fuchsias. Although they do have the advantage that if you're lucky, you get elephant hawk moth caterpillars eating the leaves, which are these. If you see the moth, it's the most beautiful lime green and pink moth. It looks like something from the tropics. And they're quite common in Britain, but unless you put a moth trap in your garden, you'll probably never see one. But their caterpillars will eat fuchsias.
Dave Goulson, you have taught me a great deal about how to improve my own back garden. I was going to say, if nothing else, but also learned a great deal of other things too. Thanks so much for coming and joining us on Downstream.
It's been fun.